Good afternoon, and welcome to Profile, the Honorable Betty Weinberg Ellerin Commission on Women in the Courts podcast series. I'm your host, Felicia Raphael, Executive Director of the Commission. We have a special guest with us today, longtime Commission member, Honorable Matthew Demick, Administrative Judge for Criminal Matters in Kings County, Presiding Judge of the Brooklyn Mental Health Court. Judge Demick has not only dedicated his court career to mental health initiatives, but to women's issues as well. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Felicia. I appreciate your invitation.
Oh, thank you for coming here all the way from across the river. I really appreciate it. So I guess we're just going to start out real basic. Tell us a little bit about yourself and where you grew up and when and how you decided to come to the legal profession.
Well, I don't know that there's that much to tell. You know, I grew up in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, and I'm one of 10 children, you know, that my parents had, and so I lived in the same neighborhood. Actually, all of us lived in the same zip code for most of our lives, but scattered a little bit now. And a pretty typical, you know, Brooklyn family. I mean, we all went to the same grammar school. The 7 boys went to the same high school. The 3 girls, the same high school, and pretty much that's it. You know, decided after college that I would go to law school, and here I am.
We're glad to have you. Was there anything particular, any mentors in college, or did you just have an interest in law?
Well, I think my interest in law stemmed from my interest in politics. I thought that I might pursue a political career, which ended with the first election I lost, and went on to lose a few more. And so you kind of, that piqued my interest. But when I got out of law school, I worked for a firm in the city and did that for about 7 years. Then my children were born, and it was tough to negotiate the travel time plus the hours. So I opened up my own practice in Bay Ridge, and was still counsel to the firm and did work for another lawyer in Manhattan, which worked out fine. And that's what I did until I came into the court system.
So what brought you to the court system? I see you were appointed in 1996, and you presided over the first domestic violence court for many years, 20 years at least. How'd you come in? How did you get appointed? And what was that whole process?
Well, interestingly, I came into the court system in '93 by becoming the court attorney for the administrative judge in Brooklyn at the time, Ronnie Aiello, who taught me a lot and was a good mentor as well. And then I decided a judgeship, an elected judgeship, there was an opening for. So I ran for that and lost the Democratic primary. But the interesting part of it is that Mike Long, who was chairman of the New York State Conservative Party, was a Bay Ridge resident, and my older brother Jack was his lawyer. And so after I lost the Democratic primary, the Conservative Party asked me if I would continue a campaign until the general election, knowing I would lose, which I said, okay, I would, and I lost. But I beat the Republican candidate. And unbeknownst to me, this was a big deal because no minor party had ever beaten a major party in any election in New York State. And so Mike decided that he would ask Governor Pataki to appoint me to the Court of Claims. And that's what happened then. I submitted my application. I went before the governor's nominating committee and was approved and confirmed by the state senate. So in 1996, I became a Court of Claims judge and was assigned to the court I sit in now, the criminal term of Brooklyn Supreme Court.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's an interesting way that you got here. That's interesting about the Conservative Party. I actually did not know that. I had been living out of New York by that time, so very interesting. Very interesting. Tell us a little bit about mental health court. That's it's something I have an interest in. I think a lot of people have an interest in, and I think a lot of people have a misunderstanding of what it is. And so can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, you had mentioned earlier that I was actually the second judge to sit in the first domestic violence court,
Okay.
which was the result of murders of women who had orders of protection in their hands from courts. And so I took over half of that calendar from Judge Leventhal, who was the first judge. And I should say I did that for about 20 years. And it was a lucky assignment because it's not that often, I think, that you get the chance to see the results of your work firsthand, right? You know, the protection of people and, of course, ensuring due process, but at the same time making sure that no one is harmed during the pendency of the action. So I always consider myself lucky to get that kind of specialized assignment early on. And then in 2002, the first mental health court opened in New York State, and I was asked to preside over that as well. And basically what it is, even though the domestic violence court can be characterized as a problem-solving court, it's not a therapeutic court. You know, it's really to keep people safe and ensure that justice is done. In the mental health court, it's very therapeutic. The idea of therapeutic jurisprudence, that a court can be used for the betterment of the people that appear before it. And New York didn't have a mental health court. And all of the courts in the country, all of the mental health courts, were misdemeanor courts. There were no felony courts. So this court was planned as a felony court, initially nonviolent felony court for adults. Okay. And so we started officially in October of 2002. So, you know, it's over 20 years as well. But soon after we opened, it was we were referred violent cases. And so it was determined that if we were going to do the good we hoped to do, we would have to accept people who actually plead guilty to a violent felony. So what happens is a case is referred to the court, a defendant is referred to the court, and an evaluation is done by a social worker on staff and a psychiatrist who we contract with. Once we get those reports, if the individual has a serious and persistent mental illness, I kind of would drill down on that and say, like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, and some others, then that's the sole eligibility requirement of the court. And if the person wants to avail themselves, nobody's forced to be in the court, then the district attorney and the defense attorney work out a plea, and my clinical team comes up with a treatment plan, and a plea is taken, and everybody knows the prison term in the event of failure of the court's requirements. But also, if there's success, then there'd be no jail, no prison, hopefully a dismissal. That would be the ideal determinant, you know, in the event of success. But in any event, we've graduated well over 1,500 at this point in time, and we're still going. And I'll add to that not only do we take violent felonies, but we take young adults, obviously, before raise the age. We took teenagers. I'll even accept cases from the youth part. Okay. And so we will take adolescents. About 5 years ago, we got a grant from the Justice Department so that we could establish a neurodevelopmental track so that individuals who have committed a crime that are on, you know, have intellectual or developmental disabilities or are on the autism spectrum, they would be eligible to come into the court now, which they would not have been until we got that grant. So that's basically, in a nutshell, what we do.
So if I had to analogize it to, let's say, and I don't like to do this, but would it be similar to drug court in the sense that it's therapeutic with an end goal of no incarceration or dismissal of charges? Would it be similar to that?
Actually based on the drug court model, in the sense that it's post-plea deferred sentencing. Now, what I'll say, that's where the analogy stops, because in drug treatment court, which have proven greatly successful, and I'm proud to say that Brooklyn was the first jurisdiction to have a drug court in New York State as well. And that's pretty much because the DA at the time, Joe Hines, was very forward-looking and worked well with the Chief Judge, Judith Kaye, at the time as well. So, but in a drug court, you kind of have the same drug sale, drug use. The treatment modality is pretty similar all the time. So we have so many different diagnoses, so many different variables in terms of what crime was committed, that it becomes a little bit more complicated than a drug court in that sense. And we often have to shift gears in the middle of treatment because we find out things that we didn't know when we started, and we obviously don't have a hair trigger, so we're looking for people to succeed.
What would you say, if there is an answer to this question, is the most common psychiatric disorder or mental illness that you see in the court, in the mental health court?
Well, I would say, you know, that can vary over the years, but the big three really are schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, schizoaffective disorder to some degree too. We will take people with post-traumatic stress disorder, some traumatic brain injuries, so it kind of varies. But if I had to really single out, probably a third of the cases would be schizophrenia.
And so you said you've had 1,500 successes, give or
Yes,
take?
yeah.
This may seem like an obvious question, but why do people fail? What causes a failure?
Well,
Or not a failure. I don't want to use the word failure. What causes someone not to get through?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of variables in that, but a lot of times it's just the fact that they have a long criminal history, that they decide that they can't do it. You know, I'll give numerous chances for people. The only time I'll impose sentence is if I feel that public safety has been jeopardized by the actions of the
Okay.
defendant. So relapse on drugs, even minor rearrests would not be cause for me not to give them another chance. But oftentimes the defendant just says, I can't do it, and they'll take, you know, the sentence.
Yeah, sometimes, yeah, and I've done criminal defense work. I've had plenty of clients who have told me I'd rather do the state bid.
Yeah.
I can't do probation, or I can't do intensive treatment. Which is a shame, but you know, that's the way it is.
Yeah, I mean, having said that, our graduation rate is 75%, so.
That's excellent.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, that's a really good success rate. My goodness. This may seem like an odd question, but have you noticed a difference in types of crimes and types of mental illness? Any differences between men and women who come before you?
Well, yes. I mean, it's very rare for a woman to commit a violent act. And I'll go back to the domestic violence part. Anytime I had a defendant, a woman who was a defendant accused of a violent act, I always looked very carefully at the case, because I was always very concerned that this was not an act of self-defense, and oftentimes that's what it turned out to be. And I could have arguments with the district attorney's office about this. So, you know, I think the more violent crimes tend to be committed by men, and not that it can never happen, you know, but if it's a violent act by a woman, I really look very carefully at it to see what was the underlying facts of the case.
Interesting. Was there any pattern to the crimes committed? Like, were certain types of crimes more prevalent regardless of gender than others? Was there any pattern, or was it just run the gamut?
Well, a lot of burglaries, you know, and assaults too. You know, you'd be surprised about assaults on police officers. We've had a lot of those, and generally it's in a state of paranoia, right?
Right.
So it's somebody suffering from schizophrenia, and they lash out because they're afraid. And the DA, in most cases, requires the consent of the victim before they're allowed the case to come into the mental health court. And I think it's pretty remarkable that, especially in terms of police officers, that they invariably agree to treatment as opposed to traditional prosecution. So I think it speaks highly of our society, really.
That is, because I don't think that's the public perception, by lay people who are not even involved in the court system. I think they don't understand mental health court, they don't understand the positive aspects of it, I think that's great that police officers are actually on board for the most part.
Yeah.
And
I mean, I could
consenting.
give you, if I could tell you one quick story.
Absolutely.
So there was a young woman, I guess she was a teenager when she came into the court, maybe late teens, early, maybe 20. And the reason I want to mention this is because the victim did not agree to treatment. The victim wanted traditional and prosecution in the most vehement sense. And what the underlying facts were is that the young woman had stabbed him with maybe a broken bottle or something like that. And it turned out that she had run away from her father in Massachusetts, was picked up by a pimp at the Port Authority terminal who prostituted her, and she was trying to get away from him when this happened. So, of course, based on those facts, the district attorney ignored the victim's wishes in this case. And I remember she ran away as soon as I put her into a program. She was in a residential program in the Bronx. She ran away. I ordered a warrant for her arrest. She came back, and I begged her not to run away again. You know, that let's make this work, and she did. And I remember she gave me like a 5-page wish list for her life, and it was beautiful. And she did very well. Last I heard from her, she came into court a couple of years, many years ago, I guess now, just to say hello. And I asked her if she would address the people in the court, because it's one thing if I say you can do this. It's another thing if she says I did this. So just a story that I think demonstrates what we do.
Exactly. We need more success stories, especially with mental health.
Yes.
I mean, somebody recently asked me, about crime in New York City and what's going on, and I said, there are a lot of mental health issues. I mean, it's everywhere, but we're a very densely populated area, so you just see it more. It's just people are out and about, and you see it more. And so I wish we had mental health courts in more of our upstate counties as well. I know Chemung just got one.
Yes. Yeah. And I know the Office for Justice Initiative is working on it, and there's a lot being done in the state.
I know. I always tell people we are a huge system. The unified court system is huge. It can't happen,
yes,
like that. It takes time, and it has to be done properly. So I'm going to circle back around, if we have time, to the domestic violence court. But I just want to, talk about the Ellerin Commission. And you've been a champion of women's rights and women's issues for decades. I mean, your entire career. And you've been on the Ellerin Commission for quite some time. What do you think? What do you think have been your or the Commission's greatest achievements, and what would you like to see done?
Well, I think it's. I came into the. Look, I graduated from law school in 1977, and honestly, just about half of my class were women. So it wasn't that I came into the system at a time when there were very few women attorneys. Probably there were very few women judges, but I think that over time, and this is important because as things even out, right, in terms of representation in the court system, then I think the problems that existed tend to dissipate. And if we look at the survey that was done 30 years ago as opposed to the one that was done a couple of years ago, we've seen a lot of growth. It's still some work to be done. The idea that women are less believed than men, we've seen studies on that. It's something that needs to be addressed and adjusted and people made aware of, right? So, I mean, personally, I never had that problem. So,
so I guess that.
I mean, don't forget, I was raised by nuns, basically.
Right.
So,
right.
And my aunt was a nun. My mother's sister and her other sister was single because of tragic circumstances. But it was like having 3 Irish mothers, can I say? It was, and the sisters I had in school, I'll talk about role models, all role models, and very strong women, that I felt could do anything.
So I guess that brings me full circle to the domestic violence court, where I kind of started off briefly. And you mentioned credibility, you mentioned believability. has there been enough progress in the domestic violence arena with credibility, victim credibility?
Well, I'm always fearful that we forget why we have domestic violence courts, that, so we're going back 30 years or so since the establishment of the first domestic violence court. And part of that is the fact that women weren't being believed. The police department manual at the time said, oh, if you come across a domestic violence situation, separate the parties, tell the husband to take a walk and cool off. Now there's a must arrest policy, right? So I mean, I could give you a lot of examples. The example of an upstate judge who said, while they had the victim in front of them, what's wrong with knock them around every once in a while? So another, and I don't think this was mean-spirited, an older judge in Brooklyn who was sent a murder case said, well, it's not really a murder because they were married. So those attitudes have changed dramatically in the last 30 years. Doesn't mean there's not, we need more change, but I'm fearful that we forget why we had this and go back to square one.
Well said. Very well said. My last question is, what would you tell young people today who are thinking of going to law school or who are maybe young attorneys? What would you say to them? What would your words of wisdom be or your advice?
Well, it's funny. I teach at Brooklyn Law School. I'm an adjunct, and I repeat this all the time. I say, life is not a straight line. So when you think that you're at the end, you're not. It's just a curve. Right. And my career kind of indicates that. You start in one place. I never expected to be, have the assignments I had. I'm very lucky. And so my advice would be, look, if you're going to pick a profession where you want to help people, then I think law is the way to go. If you're not going to be a doctor, I'd say that, you have the opportunity to affect people's lives no matter what you do. You don't have to be a litigator. Even in transactional circumstances, you're dealing with people who are vulnerable, right? Who was maybe a little bit nervous about what they're getting into, even buying a house, something like that. So you're not only their attorney, but you're their counselor, and that's what it says on the business card, right? Attorney and counselor at law, and so counsel, and that comes with experience. You get some training in law school, but as you go on and you deal with people, I think there's no finer way to, and you read a lot about the generation coming up and how there's some depression and anxiety, which basically comes from a lack of purpose or meaning. So what is more meaningful and more purposeful than serving people? And you get that opportunity and you get paid for it.
Yeah. Agreed. Yeah, definitely. And I like that analogy about the straight line. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we finish up?
I hope I didn't bore the hell out of everybody.
I don't think you bored anyone, Judge. Not at all. I want to thank you so much for being here.
That's my pleasure.
Thank you so much for your time, for coming in from Brooklyn. Thank you to all of you for watching once again, and I'll see you next time. Bye.